James walked slowly through the glass doors of the television studio. His heart was beating fast as he looked round at all the bright lights and cameras. He had been acting in movies for 15 years, but he still felt nervous when he had to talk on television shows. The studio was much bigger than he had expected. There were at least 200 people sitting in the audience, all waiting to watch the show. James could hear them talking and laughing as they waited for the program to begin. A young woman with a clipboard came over to him. "Hello, Mr. James," she said with a friendly smile. "I'm Sarah, and I work here at the studio. Are you ready for the show tonight?" James nodded and tried to smile back. "Yes, I think so." He said quietly, "I'm just a little nervous. That's all." Sarah laughed kindly. "Don't worry. Margaret is a wonderful host. She'll make you feel comfortable, and the audience loves meeting actors like you." James had been invited to the show to talk about his new movie. It was a small film about a man who helped homeless people in his city. James was proud of the movie because it told an important story about kindness and helping others. He walked over to a mirror and looked at himself. He was wearing a simple black suit and a white shirt. He didn't like wearing fancy clothes, but his manager had told him to dress nicely for television. The studio lights were very bright, and James could feel them warming his face. He watched as the camera operators moved their equipment around, getting ready to film the show. "5 minutes until we start filming," someone called out loudly. James took a deep breath and tried to calm down. He thought about why he wanted to be on this show. He wanted people to know about his movie and the important message it carried about helping people who had less than others. Margaret, the show's host, walked over to him. She was a tall woman with grey hair and kind eyes. She had been hosting this talk show for over 10 years, and everyone in Britain knew who she was. "Hello, James," she said warmly, shaking his hand. "I'm so happy you could join us tonight. I watched your new movie yesterday, and I thought it was beautiful." James felt a little better hearing her kind words. "Thank you, Margaret. That means a lot to me. Don, we have another guest joining us tonight," Margaret said. "Robert will be here too." "Do you know him?" James nodded. Everyone knew Robert. He was one of the most famous actors in the world. He was in big action movies and always made people laugh when he was on television shows. James had never met him before, but he had heard that Robert could be very funny, sometimes in ways that made other people uncomfortable. "Places, everyone," the director called out. "We're starting in 30 seconds." James walked over to the guest chairs on the stage. The audience was looking at him and smiling. He waved politely and sat down in the comfortable red chair. Margaret sat behind her big desk and looked at the main camera. "Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's show. I'm Margaret, and we have a wonderful program for you tonight." The audience clapped loudly as she spoke. "Our first guest tonight is an actor who has been making thoughtful movies for many years. He's here to talk about his new film that's touching hearts all across the country. Please give a warm welcome to James." The audience clapped again, and James stood up and waved. He sat back down and tried to look relaxed, even though his hands were shaking a little. "James, thank you for being here tonight," Margaret said with a smile. "Tell us about your new movie." James spoke slowly and carefully. "Well, Margaret, it's a story about a man who works in an office during the day, but at night he goes out and brings food to people who don't have homes. It's based on a true story." "That sounds like a beautiful film," Margaret said. "What made you want to make this movie?" James thought for a moment. "I think we all need to remember that there are people in our communities who need help. Sometimes we get so busy with our own lives that we forget about others who are struggling. The audience listened quietly as he spoke. James was starting to feel more comfortable. Just then, the studio doors opened, and Robert walked in. He was a big man with a loud voice and a huge smile. He waved at the audience, and they cheered loudly for him. And here's our second guest, Margaret announced. Everyone knows Robert from his amazing action movies. Please welcome Robert. Robert walked over to the guest area with confidence. He high-fived some people in the front row of the audience and made them laugh. Look who we have here, Robert said loudly, pointing at James, the mysterious James. You know, Margaret, this man is so quiet. I wonder if he even talks to himself at home. The audience laughed at Robert's joke, but James felt his stomach tighten. He could tell that Robert's style of humor was very different from his own quiet personality. James smiled politely and tried to stay calm. But he could sense that this evening was about to become much more challenging than he had expected. Robert settled into his chair and looked round the studio with a big grin on his face. He loved being on television shows because he always knew how to make people laugh. But tonight, something felt different to him. Maybe it was because James seemed so quiet and serious compared to his own loud personality. So James, Robert said, turning to face him directly, I have to ask you something that everyone is probably wondering about. James looked at Robert with calm eyes, waiting to hear what he would say. You've been in this business for what, 20 years now? Robert continued, his voice getting louder so everyone in the audience could hear clearly. But you still live, like you're not even famous at all. Some people in the audience chuckled, but others were starting to look uncomfortable. They could sense that Robert's tone was changing from friendly joking to something that felt. Margaret shifted in, her chair behind her desk. She had been hosting television shows for many years, and she knew when a conversation was starting to go in the wrong direction. She tried to smile and keep things light. Well, everyone has their own way of living, Margaret said, trying to steer the conversation back to safer ground. But Robert was just getting started. He turned to face the audience directly, as if he was performing a comedy show instead of having a regular conversation. You know what's really funny about James? Robert said, gesturing toward him with both hands. Most actors, when they become successful, they buy big houses and expensive cars. They go to fancy parties every night and eat at the most expensive restaurants in the city. The audience was listening, but many of them had stopped laughing. They could see that James was sitting very still in his chair, not saying anything. But not James. Robert continued, his voice getting even louder. This man has been making movies for decades. And I heard he still takes the subway to work. Can you believe that? A few people in the audience laughed nervously, but most of them were just watching quietly now. They could see that James's face was starting to look sad. Even though he was trying to keep smiling, Robert seemed to notice that he wasn't getting as many laughs as usual. So he decided to make his jokes even more personal and direct. And James, I have to ask you about something I heard, Robert said, leaning forward in his chair. Didn't you have some really difficult times a few years back? Some problems with your family? James felt his heart sink when Robert mentioned his family problems. 3 years ago, James's parents had died in a car accident, and his sister had gotten very sick with cancer. It had been the most painful time in his entire life. And he had never talked about it publicly because it was too personal and too sad. Margaret immediately knew that Robert had crossed a line that should never be crossed on a television show. She tried to interrupt and change the subject quickly. Robert, perhaps we should talk about your new action movie that's coming out. Next month, Margaret said, her voice sounding more serious than before, but Robert either didn't hear her or didn't want to stop. He was looking directly at James now, and his smile was starting to look less friendly and more cruel. I mean, James, I heard that during your difficult times. You even took the bus to movie premieres, Robert said, shaking his head as if he couldn't believe it. While other actors were arriving in expensive cars with drivers, you were getting off the city bus. The studio became very quiet now. Even the camera operators and sound technicians were looking uncomfortable. They had never seen a guest be so mean to another guest on this show before. James sat in his chair with his hands folded carefully in his lap. He could feel everyone in the studio looking at him, waiting to see how he would react to Robert's hurtful words. Part of James wanted to stand up and leave the studio right away. Another part of him wanted to say something mean back to Robert, to make him feel as hurt and embarrassed as James was feeling right now. But instead, James took a slow, deep breath and thought about the lessons his parents had taught him when he was growing up. They had always told him that when someone is mean to you, the best thing to do is to stay calm and think about what really matters in life. James looked out at the audience and saw that many of them looked worried and sad. He realized that they weren't enjoying this anymore. They had come to the studio to be entertained, but instead they were watching one person hurt another person's feelings on live television. In that moment, James understood that this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about showing everyone watching that there was a better way to handle difficult situations like this one. His heart was still beating very fast, and he could feel his face getting warm from embarrassment, but his mind was becoming clearer and clearer. He knew that what he said next would be very important, not just for himself, but for everyone who was watching him right now. The entire studio was waiting in complete silence to see what James would do next. James sat quietly for a long moment, feeling the weight of everyone's eyes on him. The bright studio lights seemed even brighter now, and he could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. He knew that millions of people were watching this show on television at home, and they were all waiting to see what he would say. He looked at Robert, who was still sitting in his chair with that same smile on his face. Though it was starting to look less confident than before, James could see that Robert was beginning to realize that maybe his jokes had hurt someone's feelings, instead of getting angry or saying something mean back to Robert. James did something that surprised everyone in the studio. He smiled. It wasn't a fake smile or a sad smile. It was a gentle, understanding smile that came from somewhere deep in his heart. "Robert," James said, and his voice was so soft and calm that everyone had to listen very carefully to hear him. "I want to thank you for giving me a chance to talk about something important." Robert looked confused. He had expected James to be angry or upset, but instead James seemed peaceful and kind. "You're absolutely right about me," James continued, looking directly into Robert's eyes. "I do take the bus sometimes. I do live in a small apartment instead of a big house, and yes, I have had some very difficult times in my life." The audience was completely silent now. Even the people who worked at the television studio had stopped what they were doing to listen to James speak. "But I want to tell you why I choose to live this way," James said, turning to look at the audience so he could speak to them too. "It's not because I don't have enough money for a car or a big house. It's because I learned something very important about what really matters in life." Margaret, the host, was sitting behind her desk with tears starting to form in her eyes. In all her years of hosting television shows, she had never heard a guest speak with such honesty and grace. James took another deep breath and continued speaking from his heart. "5 years ago, I lost both of my parents in a terrible car accident. It happened on a rainy night when they were driving home from visiting my grandmother in the hospital. The studio was so quiet that you could have heard a pin drop. Even the audience members who had been whispering to each other before were now completely silent. That night changed everything for me, James said, his voice still calm but filled with deep emotion. I realized that all the fancy cars and big houses and expensive clothes in the world couldn't bring my parents back. Nothing could take away the pain I felt in my heart. Robert's smile had completely disappeared now. He was starting to understand how much pain James had been carrying, and he felt ashamed of the jokes he had been making. During those dark months after my parents died, I learned something that changed my whole life, James continued. I learned that real strength doesn't come from having more money or fame than other people. Real strength comes from how we treat each other, especially when we're all going through difficult times. James paused and looked round the studio at all the faces watching him. He could see that his words were touching people's hearts in a way that surprised even him. I choose to take the bus because when I sit next to other people, I remember that we're all just human beings trying to do our best in life, James said. The woman sitting next to me might be going to visit her sick child in the hospital. The man across from me might be going to a job interview that could change his whole family's future. The audience was hanging on every word James spoke. Some people were wiping tears from their eyes. I choose to live simply because it helps me remember what's really important, James continued. When I don't have to worry about taking care of expensive things, I can spend more time taking care of people. James turned back to look at Robert, and his eyes were full of kindness instead of anger. Robert, I can see that you're a good person, who just wanted to make people laugh tonight, James said gently. But I hope you can understand that when we make jokes about other people's pain, we're not really making the world a happier place. Robert felt his throat getting tight with emotion. He had never expected this conversation to become so deep and meaningful. The truth is, James said, speaking to everyone in the studio and everyone watching at home, we all have struggles that other people can't see. We all have times when we feel sad or scared or alone, but we have a choice about how we respond to those feelings. James stood up from his chair and walked a few steps closer to the audience so he could speak to them more directly. We can choose to hurt other people because we're hurting, he said, or we can choose to be kind to other people because we know how much it hurts when someone isn't kind to us. The entire studio felt different now. What had started as an uncomfortable situation had become something beautiful and meaningful that everyone would remember for the rest of their lives. The atmosphere in the television studio had completely transformed. What had started as a regular talk show with jokes and laughter had become something much deeper and more meaningful. James's honest words about his life and his losses had touched every single person in the room. In the audience, people were sitting very still in their seats. Many of them had tears running down their faces, but they weren't sad tears. They were the kind of tears that come when someone says something so true and beautiful that it reaches deep into your heart and makes you feel less alone in the world. An elderly woman in the front row was quietly wiping her eyes with a tissue. She had lost her husband 2 years ago, and James's words about losing his parents reminded her that she wasn't the only person who understood that kind of pain. A young man in the back of the audience was thinking about his own struggles with finding work and feeling like he wasn't successful enough. Hearing James talk about choosing kindness over material things made him realize that maybe he had been measuring his worth in the wrong way. Robert was still sitting in his guest chair, but he looked completely different now. His big smile was gone, and his loud, confident voice had become quiet and thoughtful. He was staring down at his hands, trying to understand how the evening had taken such an unexpected turn. For the first time in many years, Robert was thinking seriously about the way he treated other people. He had always believed that making jokes and being funny was a good thing, something that made people happy. But now, he could see that some kinds of humor could actually hurt people instead of helping them. Margaret, the television host, was sitting behind her desk with her hands folded in front of her. She had interviewed hundreds of famous people over the years. She had talked to movie stars and musicians and politicians and writers. But she had never been in a situation quite like this one. In all her years of working in television, Margaret had seen guests get angry at each other, and she had seen guests who were rude or difficult to work with. But she had never seen someone respond to meanness with such grace and wisdom. The camera operators and sound technicians who worked at the studio were also affected by what they were witnessing. These were people who saw television shows being made every single day, so they usually didn't pay much attention to what the guests were saying. But tonight was different. Even the people whose job it was to focus on the technical parts of making television were listening to every word James spoke. Robert finally looked up from his hands and turned to face James directly when he spoke. His voice was much softer than it had been all evening. It was the voice of someone who had just learned something important about himself and about life. "James," Robert said, and everyone in the studio could hear that his voice was shaking a little bit. "I need to say something to you, and I need everyone here to hear it." The studio became even quieter than before. If that was possible, everyone was waiting to hear what Robert would say next. "I'm sorry," Robert said, and the words came out slowly and carefully. "I'm really, truly sorry. I came here tonight thinking that I was just being funny, but I can see now that I was being cruel." James looked at Robert with the same gentle expression he had been wearing all evening. There was no anger in his eyes, no desire to make Robert feel worse than he already felt. "I didn't mean to hurt you," Robert continued, his voice getting stronger as he spoke. "But I did hurt you, and I hurt everyone who was watching. That's not the kind of person I want to be." James nodded slowly, showing that he understood and accepted Robert's apology. "I know you didn't mean to cause pain, Robert. Sometimes when we're trying to be entertaining, we forget that the people we're talking about have real feelings and real struggles." The audience began to clap, but it wasn't the loud, excited clapping that usually happened on television shows. It was soft and respectful, the kind of clapping that happens when people want to show that they appreciate something meaningful and important. Margaret realized that this moment was too special to let pass without comment. She leaned forward in her chair and spoke to both of her guests and to the audience. "In 20 years of hosting this show," Margaret said, her voice filled with emotion, "I have never seen anything quite like what we've just witnessed here tonight." She paused for a moment, looking round the studio at all the faces watching her. "We came here tonight to talk about movies and entertainment," Margaret continued, "but instead, we've learned something much more valuable. We've learned about the power of choosing kindness over cruelty and forgiveness over anger." James stood up from his chair and walked over to where Robert was sitting. He extended his hand toward Robert, offering a handshake that represented forgiveness and understanding. Robert stood up as well and took James's hand. As they shook hands, the entire audience rose to their feet and began clapping louder, showing their appreciation for both men and for the lesson they had all learned. Together, the television show ended that night. But what had happened in the studio continued to spread far beyond those bright walls. Within hours, people who had watched the program began calling their friends and family members to tell them about what they had witnessed. The next morning, clips of the conversation between James and Robert were being shared on social media websites all around the world. People were posting the video with messages like, "This is what real kindness looks like," and "Everyone needs to see this." By the end of the week, the video had been watched by more than 10 million people in dozens of different countries. News programs were talking about it, and newspaper writers were writing articles about the power of choosing kindness over cruelty. Robert woke up the morning after the show feeling different than he had felt in years. He had not slept well because he kept thinking about James's words and about the way his own jokes had hurt Samian. He was just trying to be a good person. He called his manager and asked to be booked on another television show so he could talk publicly about what had happened that afternoon. Robert sat in a different studio and spoke directly to the camera. "Yesterday, I made some very poor choices," Robert said, looking serious and thoughtful instead of loud and joking like he usually did. "I hurt someone who didn't deserve to be hurt, and I did it in front of millions of people." The interviewer listened as Robert continued speaking from his heart. "James taught me something that I should have learned a long time ago," Robert said. "He taught me that real strength and real humor don't come from making other people feel small. They come from lifting people up and making them feel valued." Robert's honest apology was also shared widely on the internet. People who had seen him as just a funny actor began to respect him for his willingness to admit his mistakes and try to learn from them. Meanwhile, James returned to his small apartment and tried to go back to his normal, quiet life. But his mailbox was soon filled with letters from people all over the world who wanted to thank him for what he had said on the show. One letter came from a teacher in Scotland who wrote, "Dear James, I showed the video of your interview to my students, and it led to the best discussion about kindness that we've ever had in our classroom. Thank you for giving us something real to talk about." Another letter arrived from a mother in Canada. "My teenage son has been struggling with bullies at his school after watching your interview. He told me that he wants to try responding to them the way you responded to Robert. You've given my family hope." An elderly woman from Australia sent a letter that said, "I've been bitter and angry since my husband died 3 years ago. Your words reminded me that I can choose to honor his memory by being kind to others instead of pushing them away." James was amazed by how many people had been touched by that one conversation. He had simply tried to respond to a difficult situation with honesty and kindness. But it had somehow reached into the hearts of strangers round the world. The television studio where the interview had taken place began receiving requests from other shows and programs that wanted to talk about what had happened that night. Margaret, the host, found herself being interviewed by other journalists who wanted to know what it was like to witness such an unusual moment. "I've been working in television for more than 20 years, Margaret told one reporter. "I've seen famous people at their best and at their worst. But I've never seen someone handle a difficult situation with such grace and wisdom as James did that night." Margaret decided to end each of her future shows with a small message about the importance of kindness and understanding. She felt that what had happened with James and Robert was too important to forget. 3 months after the interview, James received a letter that moved him more than all the others. It was from a young boy named David who lived in a small town far from the big city where the television show was filmed. "Dear James," the letter said in a child's handwriting, "I saw you on TV with my mom. She was crying, but she said they were happy tears. I didn't understand at first. But then she explained to me about being kind even when people are mean to you last week. A bigger kid at school was being mean to me, and I remembered what you said. Instead of being mean back, I asked him if he was okay and if he needed a friend. Now we eat lunch together every day. Thank you for teaching me that kindness is stronger than meanness." James kept that letter on his desk at home, and whenever he felt discouraged or tired, he would read it again and remember why choosing kindness was always worth it. Years later, people still talked about that television interview. It became an example that teachers showed to their students, that parents shared with their children, and that friends sent to each other when they needed to be reminded about. The power of responding to difficult situations with grace. James continued to live his simple life, riding the bus and reading books and making movies that told important stories about human kindness. But now, he knew that sometimes the most important lessons happen not in movies, but in real moments. When we choose to treat each other with love and understanding, even when it's difficult to do so.